Mary LaHammer here from Twin Cities PBS with the story behind the story. And the biggest story in politics nationally and here in Minnesota is the departure or the firing of Homeland Security Director Kristi Noem. And that comes after a week when all eyes were on Washington and even here in Minnesota for a political reporter I was watching because Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison were appearing in front of Congress. They were ostensibly talking about fraud, but fraud and the immigration action are linked, of course, here in Minnesota, because that's the reason the federal government initially said they were unleashing these federal forces in Minnesota was because of fraud. And then it turned into that very aggressive immigration action and what ended up being a deadly surge here in Minnesota. But also, Kristi Noem was being questioned by members of Congress and U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's also a candidate for governor after Tim Walz got out of the race. And what you'll see here in the piece is a real interesting bit of analysis from someone who is coming to Minnesota. Kara Swisher, feared, revered tech journalist, also somebody who has the pulse of politics, has sold out the Pantages Theater for an event. Resist and unsubscribe is something that has caught on, and she has millions of followers and readers from all of her different media outlets. At one point, I asked her in my independent podcast that I've been doing, how many different shows or entities is she working for? It's about half a dozen. And she is working with somebody Almanac viewers and public TV folks know really well, Tane Danger, locally. Tane has worked with her on many other projects. Tane is helping produce this, and he helped us get Kara Swisher for this event. And we had a long chat with the two of them, really deep, interesting conversation. And we asked Kara about Kristi Noem's departure, and you'll see she did not mince words, but also said she could see this coming by watching those congressional hearings. She said the fact that Republicans were so hard on Noem showed her that the Trump administration had given them some permission and that she was already on thin ice and that her departure was very likely coming. Now, what we were asking her is maybe is Klobuchar is going to be on stage with her, or if Walz is going to be on stage. She did not say that for sure. But also diving into this movement that's very interesting that Scott Galloway, who she works with on her podcast, has led. He said this is about markets and math, not necessarily ideology or politics, and it's about the people who have the president's ear. And his theory is that, tech CEOs talk to the president and the president listens to them. So he calls it a weapon hiding in plain sight. And this is to unsubscribe, he's saying, from some of these tech platforms. And he's not saying, you have to do all of them or you have to do it forever. And what they've done through their podcast is give people some options of, okay, here is, one app. If you don't like what that company's doing or that CEO is doing, you could unsubscribe from that. So they're going to be in Minneapolis this weekend. Again, sold out crowd talking about that. And it just kind of talks about the history of boycott and, that maybe not everybody, even though Minneapolis and Minnesota did show up in person, tens of thousands did show up in person, but that not everybody wants to do that. And not everybody wants to, necessarily protest or boycott in person, but that this is a different way that people can protest. And Kara Swisher walks through how she has canceled different things and how she actually sends a note every time she says, this is why I'm canceling, and how it actually does have an impact, and that they have already been a part of hundreds of millions of dollars. They think they have calculated an economic impact from this movement that is called Resist and Unsubscribe. And they are going to be talking about some local companies. She previewed the fact that they're going to be addressing Target, and Target has already seen the impact from boycott, from backing off some DEI. They're real specifically going to talk about that. And in the podcast we talked about, and I'll link in the Substack here, they talked about how the original backing off of DEI has maintained some permanent damage to Target. And Kara Swisher, knows tech CEOs. She knows business CEOs. She talks about that really in depth. Very interesting. She kind of has the pulse of business and politics. And of course, Minnesota has a disproportionate number of Fortune 500 companies. And she also just talks about how much respect she has for Minnesota and the activism and the voter turnout and education levels, and just really fascinating. Also, Tane Danger, how he uses comedy to engage people in politics and government, and just really fascinating conversation. I hope you'll take a listen to it. The podcast Spin Sisters is over an hour long, and really deep conversation, and just the whole career of Kara Swisher and what she has done, how innovative she has been in media and technology. And she was there at the creation of email. I mean, it's just unbelievable what she has seen and built, and she's considered, just one of the power players in media and technology. I think she was a character on The Simpsons when I look at her bio. Pretty incredible. So take a look at the piece. It also covers the legislature and a lot of the movement on fraud and how difficult it is to get anything past this legislative session at the Minnesota State Capitol, in particular because the House is tied, and a tie vote means things don't pass. So take a look at that.
Governor Walz went to D.C. to testify on the misuse of federal funds in Minnesota.
I'm with you. I want your help on fraud. Why would I not want money to go to the programs I care deeply about, feeding people, clothing people, housing people? But what ICE did disrupted everything that we were doing. It disrupted our federal partners, and it forced our law enforcement agencies, who have worked hard to gain the public trust, to have the public believe in them.
Can we agree that this fraud is a serious thing, Governor Walz? Yes or no? Can we agree on that?
Yes, any fraud is serious.
Thank you. Because it's interesting that you and I agree that it's a serious thing, considering the man sitting next to you, your Attorney General Keith Ellison, just 2 months ago said, quote, "This is a political matter. This is not a serious thing," end quote.
We're down so many federal prosecutors that it has put our ability to hold these people accountable definitely at a loss.
Yes, sir.
Immigration action and fraud are now permanently linked in state and national politics.
I just asked if you had anything you wanted to say to the parents or to the family of Renee Good after you called them domestic terrorists.
I can't even imagine what they have gone through in the loss of their son and the loss of their family members.
But how about specifically calling them domestic terrorists without any evidence of that?
Ma'am, I did not call him a domestic terrorist. I said it appeared to be an incident of.
I think the parents saw it for what it was.
The spotlight on Minnesota is not going away. Legendary tech journalist Kara Swisher has also sold out the Pantages in Minneapolis for an event called Resist and Unsubscribe, produced by Tane Danger.
It was all born out of do something, like whatever it happens to be. And in Minneapolis, you're doing protests, you're doing all manner of resistance. And so it seemed like the perfect place because you guys really have shown how to do resistance in a really effective way.
You have been teasing out some surprise guests, perhaps. I know you're probably not going to reveal it. I know, but I'm just wondering maybe if there's somebody with the last name Walz or Klobuchar.
I know them. I know them.
I wonder if you've talked to them because, as a political reporter, I watched the two of them in D.C. this week, and one of them had some particularly sharp exchanges with the now former Christine Home. Can you talk about, are you surprised that she's gone now?
No, we've said it on the podcast that she's got to go.
But Nome is the first departure in the second term of Trump.
She murdered people, so that could be it. I mean, besides, she's just so incompetent the way this has been rolled out. And of course, there's not just the incompetence of her various actions, especially in Minnesota, which everyone saw the incompetence on display, and ill will.
So there's all of those things. And as Mary said, she was on Capitol Hill this week, and Amy Klobuchar was among a number of people who, really grilled her. How much do you think something like that matters? The show of her sort of being there.
That was, to me, I was oddly enough with one of the senators who grilled her, not Klobuchar. It was a Republican senator. We had an off-the-record thing. I can't say who it is, but he gave her a talking to. Let's just say they all did. See, when I saw the Republicans, especially, several Republicans went after her, and even John Kennedy, who he does his best to be a lapdog to the Trump administration, was going after her. They probably felt safe to do so.
The Bulwark news and opinion site with more than 1 million followers twice sold out the Pantages Theater and filed reports from Minneapolis.
They are definitely not winding down. We've seen just this week 6 or 7 truckloads of brand new vehicles come in.
Back at the state capitol, lawmakers are considering a variety of measures dealing with immigration action and fraud. But in a tied House, bills are struggling to advance. The House Fraud Prevention Committee heard suspicious spending is already decreasing.
This is a big deal. I mean, 62% drop when we're actually starting, we haven't even implemented really fraud prevention, or very little, but we've actually been talking about it. So we're scaring off the fraudsters.
One of the biggest things we can do as a state is better vetting of businesses and people on the front end.
One bill would require fraud to be a factor in the budget forecast.
Every single dollar that we deal with is rolled up into the forecasts. So it seems logical to me that we would similarly put in what the cost of fraud is into the forecasts.
While we appreciate the interest in creating additional tools, our twice-a-year forecasts are not the place for this analysis.
But it doesn't really lay out a plan. And so I would like, and I would be happy to work with you if you have a legitimate plan.
A House committee also failed to advance the Fraud Isn't Free Act.
Any functional private sector organization would have had hundreds of people fired in a billion-dollar scandal, including probably the CEO of that organization. And that accountability has not happened.
Now, some more data and info. You saw a lot of Republican bills there dealing with fraud. A lot of Republicans want the state auditor to be tackling fraud more. Interesting, because the auditor had a press conference today talking about the economic impact of immigration, and I want to go through that a little bit. She definitely said we are looking at hundreds of millions of dollars statewide from ICE. You know, we know the Minneapolis Police Department. She talked about abandoned cars, school enrollment, economic impact of local economies, obviously federal cuts to healthcare, food, energy programs being cut, farms, labor being lost, the workforce, and hitting against statewide impact. I think so much was focused on Minneapolis and St. Paul, but she definitely was talking about, you know, her job is looking at local governments, and that maybe has been lost a little bit. Some lawmakers that spoke at this event, Rochester Senator Liz Bolden, she's saying, you know, the national news has left, but ICE has not left completely. She kept talking about how the impact is ongoing and how ICE presence is ongoing. She is a nurse and talked about the medical community really being impacted and the loss of access to Medicaid. Food insecurity. She said there is a crisis of affordability in her community, and just really referenced the chaos that funding being shut off and put back on with no warning has created. A similar tune from Representative Brad Tabke from Shakopee. You might remember this was one of the most closely contested legislative races in the entire state. This went to recount, this went to court. It actually resulted in the early boycott of last legislative session while waiting for him to be seated. He talked about his suburb being, quote, rocked by ICE, and that they were drowning in this, and said it was the worst winter of business that they've ever seen. He said 2 businesses have now closed on Main Street. He used the example of one business that used to do $2,000 of business a day, and right now they are now doing $200. So they went from $2,000 a day to $200 a day. He said business is grounding to a halt there in Shakopee. This is a suburb. He said constructions of new homes. This was a booming suburb. He said that has virtually stopped. He wanted to emphasize, and there were national reporters on this press call. He said, the national reporters need to know that ICE is still here. It is more targeted now, he said, and it's reduced numbers. And he cited a recent ACLU study saying that they estimate ICE numbers are at about 900 in Minnesota, not the 600 that the federal government is saying. And schools and businesses are still seeing a real decline in attendance, and talked about intimidation. Fear was a big part of this, and a real threat to democracy. Democrats are concerned about the democracy and accountability. There are various measures in the legislature right now trying to create accountability for the federal action and the economic impact. So far, we're not seeing any of that get traction, again, because the political dynamic in Minnesota is so close. Yes, Democrats do have a 1-vote majority in the Senate, and the Senate might be moving some bills out, but when it's going to hit the House, and the House is tied, and again, a tie vote does not move anything along. So right now, the State House of Representatives is really stuck in gridlock on anything because of that tie vote. Also, we were hearing from Democratic lawmakers in this call that there are still children, various children that they do not know, immigrant children, the whereabouts right now, and kept saying we're not going to stop talking about Alex Preddy and Renee Good and trying to get justice for them. And we don't know now with the departure of Kristi Noem what happens and if there is a different bit of momentum behind that. You know, you saw the clip earlier in the piece of Senator Amy Klobuchar trying to see if Kristi Noem would change her rhetoric about calling them domestic terrorists, and that Noem did not back off. But now that Trump has backed off of Noem and she no longer has that job, it'll be an interesting open question if there is some kind of change of tune there and if the FBI will work with state law enforcement. We are working on a conversation coming up this week, hopefully on Almanac at the Capitol, trying to talk about the layers of law enforcement. And, you know, I noticed a really thoughtful moment from a Republican state lawmaker in committee this week who is in law enforcement, who said, you know, I haven't been shouting from the rooftop or the rafters about some of my concerns about the federal action. But he said, you know, I do have quiet conversations and it's been quiet behind the scenes. And I thought that was really nuanced and really important. And I know right now, I think we have near a record amount of folks at some level of first responders in the legislature. So we have a lot of experience, not just law enforcement, but some level of first responders in the state legislature. And not all of them have been really public. Some of them have been quietly expressing their concerns. So we're working on Wednesday night on Almanac at the Capitol, trying to have a layered, nuanced conversation about local, state, federal law enforcement and working together, because we do know the polling shows a majority of Minnesotans did want law enforcement to work together. That is kind of a point of agreement. And you're definitely hearing the rhetoric that local folks appreciated local law enforcement, and there was a rebuilding of trust, and it almost created a contrast of when people were seeing federal law enforcement and how they were behaving, they were appreciating how local law enforcement. So there was this new contrast, perhaps, and a rebuilding of trust and appreciation for local law enforcement. So I think that's an interesting point that hopefully we get to talk about and have a thoughtful conversation this week on Almanac at the Capitol that we're working on. So tune in for that. Thanks.